Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. So, let's step back into a world before smartphones, before morning traffic, before even the phrase "good night" meant anything final. We begin our sleepy journey in a small medieval village, a thatch-roofed ribbon of cottages nestled between hedgerows and history. The year is 1372, give or take a crusade. The sun has long since sunk behind the hills, and the only thing burning bright now is a sheepish little fire in a clay hearth, the kind that dances shadows across a low wooden ceiling and makes even the humble turnips look vaguely romantic. In one of these cottages, probably smelling faintly of hay, old cheese, and inexplicably of onions, a family of 5 settles in for the night. Sort of. You see, unlike us modern folk, who fall into bed with our glowing rectangles and skid into unconsciousness like a cow on ice, medieval people didn't just sleep once per night. No, they had what was called segmented sleep. 2 gentle slumbers lovingly separated by a period of calm wakefulness. Yes, that's right. The medieval night was more of a sleep sandwich. They called it first sleep and second sleep. No points for creativity, but full marks for clarity. After sundown, people would nod off after their evening porridge, sleep for a few hours, then wake around midnight for an hour or 2. Then they'd drift back into second sleep until dawn. And during that in-between time, well, it wasn't used for doom scrolling or raiding the fridge. People might stoke the fire, pray quietly, tell stories, or, if you lived with someone you fancied, perhaps get a bit friendly under the firs, if you catch my meaning. Monks might rise to chant, farmers might check on livestock, and most curiously of all, some folks just sat and thought. Imagine that, midnight thinking, not solving anything, just peacefully letting thoughts go for a moonlit walk. Doctors of the time believed the wakeful spell in the middle of the night was a natural part of a healthy rhythm, that the body soaked in sleep like a sponge in warm cider, squeezed itself out with quiet wakefulness, then filled up again before sunrise. It was a homemade circadian ballet, completely in sync with candlelight and cowbells. Of course, not every medieval person slept this way every single night. Some were too poor to afford anything resembling leisure. Others had too many children to achieve anything resembling quiet. But the idea of segmented sleep has been documented in medical records, diaries, even court testimonies. One diary entry from the 15th century casually mentions rising from first sleep and putting on a robe to kneel for prayer. Another records a farmer simply saying, woke briefly, ate onions, returned. A man, a few words, but deeply in touch with his layers of sleep. It's also worth noting that people timed their sleep by candle or by instinct. There were no bedside clocks or blinking blue LEDs. You fell asleep when darkness tucked the village in, and you rose when your sheep started yelling. Or your bladder did, whichever came first. Back at our cottage, the father, let's call him Edric, is now snoring with a sound similar to a clogged bellows. His wife, Maud, lies beside him, eyes wide open. She is in that in-between time, awake not from stress, but from tradition. She pulls on a shawl, sits by the cold hearth, and watches the embers think their slow, red-orange thoughts. She might say a prayer, or mentally compile a list of things she needs to do tomorrow. Mend the fence, trade wool for eggs, and finally ask old Hendrik to stop letting his goats wander into her garden. Outside, The stars hang thick and quiet. The church bell doesn't ring. It's not that kind of story. But somewhere, an owl hoots once, as if to confirm the hour. The village is asleep, twice really, but only gently. Now the embers fade to ash. Maud stretches her arms in the candlelight and pads back to her straw mattress. Edric is still snoring like a broken hurdy-gurdy. She settles beside him, exhales, and lets the soft hand of second sleep cradle her back into the velvet dark. And in the monastery down the road, yes, Brother Oswin did, in fact, forget to feed the cat. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves as the moon casts her silver glow over slumbering thatched roofs and the distant hoot of an owl echoes in the forest gloom. We settle gently into the soft dust of history, right between a layer of woolen blankets and a few dubious smells best left unexplored. Welcome to the medieval night, where everyone's tucked in by candlelight and the local rooster sleeps peacefully, having not yet received the memo about his sunrise solo. Now, before we drift too far into dreams, let's candle flicker our focus back on the curious concept of biphasic sleep, or as it was known in olden times, totally normal bedtime. Medieval folks typically didn't sleep in one long stretch as we do today. Instead, they cozied up for a first sleep, woke for an hour or two, then dozed off again for the second sleep. Just imagine telling your boss that your productivity's down because you haven't had your second nap of the evening. They might call HR, or possibly your doctor. But for medieval people, this wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Blame, or perhaps toast, the natural rhythms of light and darkness. With scarce artificial lighting and no glowing smartphones to doom scroll through, the average medieval evening was run entirely by the sun's retirement plan. When it clocked out, so did everyone else. And when that cozy darkness wrapped itself around homes like a woolen shawl, bodies and brains alike decided it was bedtime. Around 8 or 9 p.m., many folks drifted into first sleep, which typically lasted 4 hours or so. Now here's where it gets dreamy. We're not even at the weird part yet. After the first sleep ended, somewhere around midnight or a bit later, people would wake up. But not in a, oh no, I have an early Zoom call kind of way. No, this waking period, called the watch, was calm, gentle, and oddly productive. People might read by candlelight, assuming they were literate and not too worried about setting their hem on fire. Some prayed. What better time to ask forgiveness than in your nightshirt at 2 a.m.? Others engaged in quiet conversation, mending clothes, or even making new little medieval people, if you catch my dusk-shrouded drift. There are actual records, warm and blush-worthy ones, of monks and married couples writing about this period as a favoured window for intimacy. In some sense, the post-first sleep phase was the original Netflix and chill, only with fewer streaming options and slightly more goose feathers. What's truly remarkable is that people didn't seem bothered by waking up in the middle of the night. Unlike us, they weren't clutching melatonin gummies or begging their minds to please, just please stop reciting every embarrassing moment since the year 1392. Rather, they saw the period between sleeps as a gift, an interlude to think, wander softly around the home, or have a quiet moment under the stars, if they were daring enough to drift outside. One 17th century medical manual even recommended the watch as the ideal time to digest food, reflect on dreams, or commune with thy soul. Which sounds lovely, until you remember they also prescribed leeches for aching joints. Even great minds got in on the midnight musings. The philosopher Thomas Aquinas, that devout and scholarly cloud of a man, was said to compose entire theological arguments in the quietude between sleeps. And in more humble cottages, farmers and housekeepers alike might have drowsily reminisced about the day's work, letting their tired minds pull the threads of memory into soft, subconscious knots. So why did this pattern disappear? Let me whisper you a clue. Just this side of the oil lamp. The Industrial Revolution did more than give us factories and awkward social hierarchies. It also stole the stars. As lamps grew better and the city burned brighter, nighttime no longer belonged to owls and poets. It belonged to the clock, and the clock demanded efficiency. But don't nod off too fast. Before we drift toward ticking timepieces and the strange sleeping rituals of the Enlightenment elite, let the gentle hours between first and second sleep lull you. Picture a quiet, straw-strewn room glowing with embers. A child murmurs in her hay-stuffed bed. A couple shares a whispered prayer. And the moon hangs heavy and watchful, pondering yet again why humans are so fond of doing peculiar things at peculiar hours. Whatever the hour on your own candlelit clock, let your eyes rest easy. There's more to come. As night's velvet curtain drifted over medieval Europe, the clatter of carts ceased. The chickens grew philosophical, and even the cat, who normally had strong opinions on moonlight fence-top politics, settled down into something approaching civility. The village, once alive with gossip, goats, and the occasional overconfident travelling lute player, now rested under a sky bedazzled with stars and vaguely threatening owls. And yet, this wasn't the beginning of a night's peaceful slumber. No, this was only the start of the first sleep. You see, in the days of yore, back when lords ruled manors, manors ruled serfs, and nobody quite ruled over their plumbing, it was entirely natural to divide the night in two, like a particularly sleepy sandwich. People didn't just doze off at sundown and wake up at sunrise. They packaged their night into two distinct portions. First sleep, a gentle descent between dusk and midnight, and second sleep, a cozy catch-up from early morning until dawn. But what sorcery, you ask, compelled our forebears to slice their slumber in twain? Well, let's picture ourselves nestled inside a small timber-framed cottage, the kind where the roof leaks theatrically and the walls are held together by hope, clay, and someone's grandmother's spit. The family would huddle together on straw-stuffed sacks, or, if they were lucky, a wooden platform that passed for a bed. Dressed in heavy linens, nightcaps, and the kind of woolen socks that could deflect arrows, they'd retire early. Not from particular virtue, mind you, but because candles were precious, and artificial light was about as common as a dragon with anxiety. Without smartphones, Netflix queues, or precariously tall stacks of unread novels, people simply went to bed when it got dark. Sunset was the medieval version of a subtle push notification. Time to wind down. So off to sleep they went, wrapped snugly like sleeping burritos. But because they turned in so early, perhaps as early as 8 p.m., they'd often wake in the middle of the night, wide awake, not by accident, but as a natural rhythm. As it turns out, this biphasic sleep pattern wasn't a sign of insomnia. It was, in fact, the circadian rhythm's original blueprint. Historical references describe this early waking period, known charmingly as the watch, as a kind of midnight intermission, a pause between Act 1 and Act 2 of the great nightly nap. And what did folks do during this drowsy halftime show? Well, they didn't just lie there gloomily reciting medieval limericks, although, let's admit, that would be on brand. First sleepers would experience a lucid, dreamy state, perfect for reflection prayer, or a bit of gentle scheming. Medieval guides would recommend that this was a holy hour, ideal for whispering one's secrets to the heavens or pondering why goats insist on climbing, things not meant to be climbed. Some, however, took a more interactive approach. Couples might use this time for candlelit marital diplomacy. Letters were written, wood stoves were stoked, neighbors were visited, entirely unannounced, so very pretext message. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't strange. It was cultural. In fact, one 16th century French physician, who likely owned more mustache than sense, described this interval as the best time for conception, linking passionate pursuits with this peak in post-sleep rejuvenation. One wonders what romantic advice was scrawled on scrolls and mailed discreetly by pigeon. And it wasn't just in France. Across England and much of Europe, written records and diaries quietly betray this double sleep phenomenon. From monastic texts to farmhouse almanacs, scribes made note of the watch, not like a mysterious interruption, but a perfectly ordinary phase of the night. It makes one wonder if entire generations embraced the pause in their slumber and even relished it. What might we be missing in our obsession with 8 uninterrupted hours? There's something quaint, even comforting, about a society that permitted midnight candle flickers and whispered thoughts before gliding back into dreams. So as the fire crackled low and the embers hummed soft lullabies, our medieval villagers, having tended their short midnight rituals, would ease themselves back beneath woolen covers, slipping into second sleep like cats curling into teacups. Not rushed, not stressed, just naturally returning to where they had left off. And while the stars gazed on, unconcerned with the petty goings-on of dirt-dwelling bipeds, the night wrapped itself once more around the dreaming world. A tradition had been planted, quiet, practical, and entirely forgotten by the time the electric light bulb began its bright, buzzing conquest. But that, dear listener, is a flicker of curiosity we'll save, gently, for later, somewhere in the colder pockets of time, where drafty stone walls hugged closer to candlelit rooms and a chamber pot lurked ominously in the corner. A medieval villager by the name of Alfric prepared for bed. Not just once, oh no, but twice, as was the cozy custom in those days. But we're not quite ready to tug at the blankets of segmented sleep just yet. First, we have to dim the hearthlight of another puzzle. What did going to bed actually mean in a world without clocks, central heating, or foam mattresses with 30-year warranties? You see, bedtime in the Middle Ages wasn't so much a fixed moment as it was a gradually unraveling affair. The sun would bid a long orange farewell sometime after supper, which, depending on the season and the clanging of village bells, could be anything from a pewter bowl of onion stew to something suspiciously squirrel-shaped. With darkness thickening like porridge and no electricity to insist otherwise, people would start drifting toward slumber earlier than we might today, often not from exhaustion, but simply because what else was left to do after mending one's own socks by candlelight and scratching cryptic wounds without the aid of Google. Now, when it came to the actual bed, it's best to adjust your modern expectations. The average medieval bed was a baffling contraption of ropes, which needed tightening often. Hence, the well-worn phrase, sleep tight, supporting a straw mattress that poked with the vengeance of 1,000 dry hedgehogs. If you were fancy, say a minor lord or a bold widow with a thriving goat cheese enterprise, you might have feather stuffing or even a mattress cover. And let's not ignore the prestige of a bed curtain, not just for privacy, but to keep the bitter draughts from sneak attacking your toes. Ælfric himself, a thatcher by daylight and amateur sleep philosopher by nightfall, had perfected the sleepy shuffle, removing his woolen hose with a grunt and flinging them to the foot of the bed, likely to be retrieved in the morning by an opportunistic cat. He'd climb beneath layers of blankets, usually itchy, possibly damp, always heavy. These blankets were not designed for fashion, but to fend off the creeping cold of a winter more interested in your soul than your comfort. And then silence, but not complete silence. Oh no, houses were alive in those days. Groaning wood, cooing doves in the rafters, the occasional snort from a roommate/cow if you were particularly rural. Churches would ring a bell known as the curfew at dusk, a gentle metallic nudge reminding people to bank their hearth fires lest the night and their homes both burn too brightly. By candlelight's end, nestled in the gravitational embrace of their lumpy bedding, Ælfric and his contemporaries would drift into what we now know was their first sleep. This lasted about 4 hours. Golden, uninterrupted rest tinged with dreams often considered meaningful. Dreams, in fact, were something of a medieval TikTok, open to interpretation, definitely overshared, occasionally prophetic. But more curious still was what happened between the first and second sleep. The delicious in-between time when folks would awaken naturally, often around midnight, for a period of quiet wakefulness. Far from being a sign of insomnia or ghost-related interference, this was entirely expected. In that gentle interlude, villagers might stoke the fire, pray devoutly, reflect on dreams with Freudian zeal before Freud was even a glint in history's eye. Or, let us not tiptoe around it, engage in starlit cuddles of the marital kind. Ælfric, ever the contemplative thatcher, used this time to think through tricky roofing dilemmas and invent new verses for songs about goats he insisted were misunderstood intellectuals. Others might venture a silent stroll around the homestead, relieve themselves in the freezing outdoors while humming Gregorian chants, or check that the chickens were still unwitting hostages in their coop. This practice of segmented sleep, bookended by darkness and punctuated with peaceful midnight musings, wasn't a quirky village habit. It was widespread, from the humblest thatch-roofed hut to the bowing beams of castle bedrooms. It shaped the rhythms of life, prayer, intimacy, and even crime. Strangely easier to nick a pig when half the town is up wandering between slumbers. But for now, let the image linger of Ælfric, yawning beneath his goose-feather pillow stolen from his cousin's engagement party, already drifting back towards second sleep. The embers whisper, the stars look on, and the medieval world turns softly under moonlight. Soon, we'll inch closer to discovering how and why this dreamy double sleeping vanished altogether. But not just yet. For now, let your own eyelids weigh down like wool blankets and rest in the lullaby of a slower, candlelit world. Once the medieval sun dipped below the thatched rooftops of damp English villages and torchlit keeps, the world didn't simply fall silent and unconscious. No, instead, it glowed with a strange kind of hush, the kind that whispers stories into the dark. You might imagine people blowing out their candles, kissing their firewood goodnight, and drifting into an uninterrupted dreamscape. And yet, dear listener, that's not quite how the night played out, because around the fire-hardened hearths, in stone cottages wrapped in wool and peat moss, something charmingly peculiar happened. They only slept the first sleep. Yes, first. What followed was not some bleary-eyed stumble toward a coffee pot. No espresso machines yet. Instead, after 4 or 5 hours of this blessed first sleep, people, well, they woke up on purpose in the darkest hours of the night. Somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, they rose, not in a panic, not for work, not even for bathroom emergencies. They just woke, like cake timers gone off. Ding. Now, before you protest, squinting into the spiritual meaning of this mysterious midnight interlude, don't worry. The medieval folk knew what they were doing. They called it the watching, though admittedly, that sounds a bit eerie unless accompanied by a snack tray and warm socks. This time, between first and second sleep, wasn't a fluke. It was a cherished, culturally accepted part of daily life. Everyone from farmhands to friars to an occasional forgetful knight participated in this witching hour intermission. According to 13th century medical texts and court records, this waking period was the perfect time for, and I quote, study, prayer, reflection, conversation, and of course, some rather enthusiastic marital activities. Yes, some old manuscripts refer to it as the best time for conception. Nothing spices up romance like ambient owl hoots and the scent of wood smoke. But more often than not, people simply sat in silence. Families might tend the fire. The pious prayed or read psalms, whispering by lamplight. A shepherd might inspect the sky or poke his slumbering goat with a suspicious squint. The wealthier elite, ever the overachievers, may have taken this window to read. That's if they were among the lucky few who could, in fact, read. Most books were handwritten, chained to desks, or extremely flammable, so bedtime stories weren't quite as plentiful as they are now. Still, long before the clutter of blue light and push notifications, people had space for this twilight breath, a pause between dreams, a lull within the lull. They viewed the night as a time not merely for rest, but for restoration of the soul, a chance to reset both sinew and spirit. And crucially, this wasn't just a quaint European habit. Across various parts of the world, pre-industrial societies showed signs of biphasic or even polyphasic sleep. From East Asia to Africa to the Americas, people sometimes slipped into and out of sleep more than once per night. It turns out, without electricity or Netflix's autoplay button, the night stretches remarkably long. So long, in fact, that the body, undistracted by TikToks or the scent of pizza rolls, naturally settles into a rhythm of 2 slumbers with a quiet spell between them, floating somewhere in the inky hours before dawn. In those in-between hours, time itself seemed to dilate. No clocks ticked, no trains howled at a distance. The only company was your own heartbeat, and maybe a snoring sibling or two in a room with questionable insulation. As the night wore on, the second sleep arrived gently, like a loyal friend returning for a goodbye hug. People folded back into bed, if they'd ever left it, curling up under wool blankets and fading once more into dreams. This time, slower, deeper ones. Researchers today suggest that this second sleep often involved longer periods of REM sleep, that wild, fluttering dream phase where your brain behaves like a caffeinated playwright trapped in a funhouse. But for medieval folk, there were no REM charts, only the knowledge that the second sleep was a gift, not an obligation, but a reunion, a soft return. Some might wonder what changed. Why don't modern humans bask in this dual sleep glory, this midnight symphony of wakefulness and calm? Well, that tale, dear listener, carries us through candlelit alleyways, into the bowels of factories, and under the hum of gaslights. But that's a story best told once you've tucked your blankets just so, and let your eyelids droop like forgotten curtains in a monastery library. by the glow of a flickering candle, casting long shadows on a half-timbered wall, we find ourselves in the heart of a medieval home. And no, it's not haunted, though the creaking roof beams might say otherwise. Evening has settled in like a velvet blanket. The stew has been eaten, the fire banked for the night, and shoes, well, wooden clogs more like, have been kicked aside. Our medieval sleeper has shuffled off to bed. But here's the secret. This isn't a straight shot to dreamland until sunrise. It's merely part one. You see, to our ancestors, the night was divided into acts, much like a mystery play at the village fair, but with fewer devils on stilts and more snoring. After the first sleep, usually from dusk until sometime between midnight and 2, a curious thing would happen. People would wake up, not restlessly, not tossing and turning in existential dread, but in a calm, deliberate lull. This interlude even had a name: the watching, or the midnight waking. It wasn't a glitch in the medieval matrix, it was the feature, and what people did during this twilight intermission. That's where things get interesting. In a very cozy, candlelit kind of way, some would pray, not just "please help me find my wool hose tomorrow" sort of prayers, but deeply meditative, rhythmic recitations. Monks and nuns built entire routines around nighttime devotions, filling the darkness with soft chants and whispered Latin while trying not to stub their toes on ancient chapel steps. Others might use this quiet time for reflection, lying in bed and pondering the weighty matters of life, like, say, if the cow was indeed looking peaky today, or perhaps if Goodwife Higgett's blackberry mead was, in fact, stronger than medicinal. And then there were those who talked. Whole families would sit up and chat in bed, bundled together like a human casserole under shared blankets, for which we can all be grateful central heating was invented later. People would exchange stories, share dreams, or discuss who had let the fire go out again. Some households even took this opportunity to do a bit of, well, marital communion, let's say. Medieval medical texts, written by men of course, suggested that this post-first sleep window was the best time for marital activity. As it was said, the body was rested, the mood was calm, and the children were finally asleep in their little piles of straw. You'll be comforted to know that even physicians like the 13th century scholar Arnaud de Villanova had opinions about it. He declared such timing was auspicious for maintaining the humours. Whether you interpret that as bodily balance or simply keeping good spirits in the bedroom is gently left to the imagination. Meanwhile, the less romantically inclined used this peaceful interval for small practical tasks: mending clothes, stoking the embers, checking on the livestock, or, for the particularly daring soul in rural Kent, writing more accurate sheep counting systems. Believe it or not, poetry and prose were sometimes penned in the hush between sleeps. Evidence even hints Chaucer may have composed by candlelight in such hours, though we suspect he may have dozed off halfway through a line or two. Many a time hath he nodded at his desk. Of course, not everyone used this mid-sleep gap productively. Some folks just sat on the edge of the bed, scratching their foot through the hole in their socks. Because yes, even 10 centuries ago, sock woes were timeless. But there's something profoundly human wrapped inside this ancient rhythm. A moment of pause, a breath in the folds of the night. Modern life marches forward in relentless hours, but medieval nights had space. The kind of space that gave way to dreams, prayers, pillow talk, or sitting silently in the dark with one's thoughts and a candle stub. Over time, as artificial light grew stronger and the night banished its shadows, this gentle rhythm faded. But for hundreds of years, this natural dual sleep was not only normal, it was cherished. Still, it leaves us with a warm, if slightly drowsy curiosity. If waking up in the middle of the night today feels unnatural, perhaps the unnatural thing was ever stopping. So as the candle sputters low and the hearth whispers to itself, we gently tiptoe into the second sleep. But before our eyelids flutter all the way down, there's one more question to dream on. What did the clock do before there were clocks? We'll roll that riddle beneath our pillow as we ease quietly onward. By now, our medieval sleeper has had their first nap, possibly chatted with a neighbor through a thin, smoke-streaked wall, and is considering whether or not to get up and check on the pigs. It's probably around 1:30 in the morning, that magical time when everyone today is either at a grimy 24-hour diner or deeply regretting their life choices in a fast food parking lot. But back in the Middle Ages, this was not a time to panic about insomnia. It was simply intermission. Across candle-lit cottages and echoing stone manors, second sleep awaited like the encore of a particularly uneventful performance. In this gentle lull between the first and second sleep, our long-ago friends had a rare and quiet freedom. No one was expected to be doing much of anything, which, as you might imagine, was a kind of medieval luxury all its own. And so, there developed a curious habit among both peasants and nobles alike. Right there, in those low-slung hours between two slumbers, people reflected, prayed, wrote, or puttered about like well-meaning ghosts haunting their own kitchens. Now, if you happen to be a monk, and let's assume for the moment that you have taken a vow of silence and have developed very high opinions about turnips, then this stretch of night was ideal for the practice of vigils. Vigils were spiritual watches, where monks would rise in the deepest parts of the night to chant, pray, and occasionally steal each other's sandals for reasons not fully explained in historical texts. Outside the cloisters, however, things were slightly less holy and a touch more practical. Here is where it gets interesting. These wakeful hours became a cherished time not for work, not exactly, but for soft, clever things. Husbands and wives talked, really talked. Stories were told. Dreams were shared. Sometimes, if the house was blessed with a bit of parchment and a generous candle, letters were penned or recipes were concocted. The early medieval burnt oat mush surprise wasn't going to season itself. It was also, as some historians romantically speculate, the favorite time of poets, particularly the unwashed, half-starving variety, who were prone to scribbling love ballads to women who mostly hadn't noticed them because they were already betrothed to someone who owned a very large pig. In France, this period of night was sometimes referred to as dorvel, a compound word mixing sleep and wakefulness, a pleasant contradiction, like jumbo shrimp or accurate pirate map, a word that admitted this hour was neither here nor there, a cozy, murky place between day duties and dream journeys. Imagine candlelight flickering on the edge of a battered wooden table. A man, calloused hands still smelling faintly of sheep, mutters a short prayer and leans back onto his straw mattress, pausing to scratch at a flea with nearly philosophical resignation. Across the room, his wife hums half a lullaby she barely remembers. Outside, the owl makes that noise again, and they both agree. It's definitely haunting the chimney. Mind you, city dwellers had their own version of these ghostly hours. In urban neighborhoods, where people lived in delightful chaos atop one another like layers in a confused sandwich, there were all sorts of nighttime stirrings. Night watchmen patrolled the crooked alleyways with lanterns and a stick. presumably for poking suspicious barrels. Bakers rose early, or never quite went to sleep, already kneading dough for a morning that still felt like a rumor. And as always, someone somewhere was serenading a window with a lute and a terrible sense of pitch. All of this makes you wonder. Maybe this waking hour wasn't insomnia at all. Maybe it was a gift, an intimate, unsupervised recess in the calendar of sleep. A sacred time when the medieval world stretched, yawned, and allowed itself for a precious flicker of time to simply be. And soon, the eyelids grew heavy again. The last candle fizzled out like an apologetic firefly. People, whether peasant, friar, or aspiring lute strummer, drifted back into second sleep, their final descent into the wool and feather dreams of that chilly, ink-black night. Which leaves us wondering, what exactly made that second sleep so exquisite? But more on that in a moment. Around the year 1320, there lived a monk in Flanders who recorded the most incredible insight into medieval sleeping habits, without realizing he'd done anything especially notable at all. His name was Brother Odo, and he kept an impressively dull but invaluable diary, mostly concerned with things like bread, sheep, and why Brother Thomas had eaten all the pickled turnips again. But one foggy evening in February, Odo wrote, "Woke after matins, sat by hearth, prayed, spoke with Brother Clement about the goose, returned to sleep." And there it was, quietly couched between contemplation and a poultry-related grievance, a glimpse into how medieval folk didn't just sleep once. They slept twice. 2 sleeps, first sleep and second sleep, like Tolkien's hobbits, but with more coarse wool and fewer pipes. Now, this wasn't a quirk reserved for monks or folks with unusually structured duck-based conversations. In fact, it was a widespread, almost universal rhythm among medieval Europeans. From peasants to nobles, from bustling towns to cows that, granted, didn't write things down, but no doubt noticed when people got up in the middle of the night and started poking around with a candle. The first sleep typically began shortly after nightfall, and keep in mind, this would be quite early, especially in winter, when darkness fell like a curtain over everything by 6 p.m, or even earlier. People would wind down after their evening meal, lie on their straw or feather-stuffed bedding in the dim glow of a fire, and drift into a kind of sleep that was considered, at the time, an utterly natural first act of the night. Then, about 4 hours later, they would wake. Not in the panicked, coffee-deprived way many of us wake at 2:30 a.m, only to wonder if their alarm clock has betrayed them, but in a calm, almost expectant way. They called this middle period the watch, or simply the waking. The moon was usually high by then, shining through panes of horn or holes chinked with cloth. The village would be hush, but not silent. You might hear hearths being stirred, the gentle rustle of someone lighting a taper, or even the squeaky murmur of neighbors having a quiet chat through the wall. People did all sorts of things during this time. Some prayed, of course. It was the medieval era, after all. But others might read, sew, tend to small tasks, or, as one 15th century doctor rather cheekily noted, engage in the work of procreation, which was a fancy way of saying couples often, cuddled with purpose during the waking interval. It was thought to be a particularly auspicious time for, well, such endeavors. After an hour or two, they'd go back to bed. Second sleep would carry them into the dawn, cocooned in the long stretch of restful slumber that followed that curious little pocket of wakefulness. There was no pressure to stay unconscious for a full, unbroken 8 hours. No Fitbit to shame them. No inspirational productivity quote to make them feel guilty for leaving the wheel of industry temporarily unattended. And that, dear drowsy traveller, may explain why no one in medieval Europe wrote angsty blog posts titled, "Help, I keep waking up at 1 a.m. It was perfectly normal, expected even. Nighttime just had two halves. What's truly delightful is how ordinary all this was. Great figures of the age, scholars, judges, even kings, all wandered, sleepy middle path between two slumbers. In fact, Sir Thomas More mentioned the concept in passing, as did literary works from Chaucer to the 17th century. And yet today, we seldom remember this once universal two-act performance of the night, which, let's be honest, sounds rather appealing on certain evenings. Imagine waking gently at midnight, pouring yourself a warm mug of something, writing a letter to a friend by candlelight, or idly messing about with embroidery, and then curling up again with newly warmed blankets and letting second sleep carry you off like a gentle ferry across the Lethe. Of course, this rhythm began to fade eventually. Artificial lighting, especially gas and electric light, eventually stretched evenings longer, reshaped sleep, and shoved the two-sleep habit into the forgotten drawers of history. But don't worry, we'll get to that in good time. For now, let's linger in that moonlit intermission where the hearth glows softly, the world is quiet but not yet still, and cobbled streets glisten under the winter mist. Outside your small wooden house, snow might be falling. Inside, the coals are warm, and your second bed awaits. And just as second sleep beckoned to medieval dreamers, something else stirs gently in the shadows of the past, whispering, perhaps, of how candlelight reshaped everything. Let us drift now to a moment in time when the stars glowed a little brighter. The fire crackled just a touch louder, and the goat in the yard was considered a reliable alarm system. We find ourselves somewhere in the low-lit hush of a medieval village, the kind with wattle and daub cottages that look perpetually surprised by their own roofs. Inside one such home, nestled under a thatched cap and a sky full of stars, lived the venerable Sir Oswin, a retired knight, now mostly in the business of soup-making and storytelling. Each night, Sir Oswin followed a most peculiar routine. He'd slip into bed shortly after the fire burned down and the hens emitted their last opinion of the day. He'd drift off into a rich, soot-scented sleep, only to awaken a few hours later, with the unnerving certainty of a rooster who'd learned how to read clocks. But Oswin didn't rise in a frenzy. No. He'd sit upright, stretch his arms like a cat with a mortgage, and proceed to read from a book, sharpen his quill, or, on more theatrical nights, quietly recite prayers in Latin, with only the occasional mumble betraying that he'd forgotten the words halfway through. This strange middle-of-the-night interlude was not unique to Oswin. Across medieval Europe, many people naturally slipped into what was known as the first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, then a second sleep. To them, this wasn't an eccentric nocturnal hiccup. It was as typical as eating turnips or complaining about millers. This wakeful slice between sleep cycles often lasted an hour or more and was an accepted part of life. Some rose from bed to visit neighbors and chat quietly by candlelight. Others prayed, meditated, or just stared pensively into the fire, pondering eternal questions like, why did I marry someone who thinks bathing is a form of heresy? It turns out that our ancestors were rather sophisticated sleepers. Without the tyranny of fluorescent lights and late-night reality shows, people lived in harmony with natural rhythms. The human circadian cycle, when unbothered by artificial light, tends toward a biphasic pattern, essentially a nap with ambitions. The first sleep visited just after darkness fell, and the second arrived shortly before sunrise, taking up residence till cockcrow and beyond. This period in between, the space between sleeps, wasn't seen as insomnia, but rather a divine gift. Monks in monasteries, for instance, turned this time into an opportunity for nocturnal devotion. Known as matins or vigils, these sleepy prayers were recited in candlelit chapels while the rest of the world snored through its dreams of dragons and debt. Even medical texts of the time referenced the first sleep. A 13th century doctor might advise a patient to rise after the first sleeping and take a stroll when the stars are high, for it doth help digestion and cool unwanted humours. Of course, the unwanted humours could range from melancholy to sudden onset frogs in the pantry. Medieval medicine was charmingly optimistic about what a moonlit walk could mend. Interestingly, beds themselves supported this sleepy duality, literally. They were constructed more like cozy sandwich planks than today's cloud-like menace. A simple wooden frame filled with straw or feathers and covered in linen offered just enough comfort to encourage sleep, but not the kind of indulgent gravitational pull that would make a person miss the angelic bells of midnight prayers. Now imagine the streets of a medieval town, silent but for a few cloaked figures moving like ghosts between warm homes, perhaps to borrow fire, or trade gossip, or sneak a glimpse of the stars and wonder what in heaven's name Orion was ever doing with that belt. Children, too, would occasionally awaken during this twilight interval, rubbing eyes and whispering to one another under the woolen coverlets, voices muffled like bees in a boot, and perhaps someone somewhere added a fresh log to the fire and watched it hiss back to life, casting dancing shadows upon the walls like the memory of stories not yet told. These quiet nighttime rituals gave way, in time, to the modern idea of sleeping all in one go, consolidated, industrial scheduled, 8-hour sleep. But back then, the division of the night was as natural as the rising sun. As the hour grows late, and we leave Oswin tending quietly to his fire, quill in one hand and half-written verse in the other, let us tiptoe into the dreams of the medieval mind. For in the hush between two sleeps, one could ponder, pray, or merely wrap oneself tighter in a blanket and wonder whether the moon was staring back. And just beyond that flicker of firelight, something stirs, perhaps not another dream, but a curious thought yet to be fully dreamed. In the chilly hush of a 12th century night, somewhere between the earthy stockings hanging by the hearth and a rather suspiciously lumpy mattress stuffed with straw, something curious stirred. Not a ghost. Ghosts didn't stir, they haunted, preferably with flair. No, this movement was far humbler. It was a human being, yawning widely in the candlelit dark, sitting up in bed for what we, modern folk, might endearingly call an intermission. You see, back then, people didn't just sleep once. They slept twice. Not in shifts, and not because of caffeine-fueled Netflix binges. No, this was simply how their nights passed, in 2 cozy rounds, with a little waking window in between. That curious space between first sleep and second sleep was a kind of midnight me time. The question is, what on earth did they do with it? Some naturally prayed. Prayer was the medieval equivalent of scrolling through inspirational quotes at 2 a.m., only with Latin and kneeling. Others might read, assuming they were literate and fortunate enough to own a book and a candle. And yet others, in a development both surprising and deeply relatable, visited the chamber pot. Now, chamber pots, bless them, were not vessels of glamour, but they were vital in homes that lacked what we might call modern plumbing, or indeed any plumbing. The multi-use quality of the waking interval meant it was the perfect time to lighten the load, as it were, and do so before second sleep swept in like an old friend, offering a second helping of dreams. For many, the interval was also time for conversation. The fire would still be warm, its embers glowing like little sleepy-eyed dragons, and the house, be it a peasant's cottage or a manor hall, would buzz softly with the rustling of those who stirred. Couples murmured sweet nothings in the dark, or occasionally discussed the poultry situation, which was always both urgent and mysterious. Interestingly, medieval medical manuals even advise patients to monitor their dreams during first sleep. According to them, it was believed those dreams were more divine, whereas second sleep dreams were mostly influenced by cheese. That's not a joke. Well, it's also a joke, but it's true. Medieval scholars sincerely believed different stages of sleep yielded different prophetic qualities. It's a good thing they didn't have burritos. And still, while some stayed in bed, simply staring at the thatched ceiling and contemplating the eternal struggle of goose versus duck feather pillows, others took to wandering. Not far, mind you. There were wolves, and worse, pointed furniture in the dark. But in monasteries, for instance, monks would rise to attend matins, an early hour's prayer before returning to their slumber. This was medieval multitasking at its holiest. Farmers sometimes used this quiet interval to check on animals or get a small head start on dawn chores. Imagine that, stepping into the crisp night with just your tunic, your lantern, and your regrets about not staying in bed. And yet, for them, this was simply how life ticked. The stars kept time, the cock crow marked it, and somewhere between snooze 1 and snooze 2, life meandered on. Some physicians of the era claimed this 2-part sleep was the healthiest way to rest. The waking gap allowed the body to digest, the soul to meditate, and the mind to reflect. It almost sounds ideal, until you remember there were almost certainly mice in the mattress. Still, there's something charming about the idea, isn't there? That somewhere, 1,000 years ago, a wool-clad mother woke briefly in the night, fed the fire, kissed a child's brow, and returned to sleep beneath the slow exhale of an oak-beamed roof. That in castles and cottages alike, the night was not a monolith of darkness, but instead a dance. First sleep, a pause, then second sleep, as if dreams themselves had an intermission. After all, even stars prefer curtain calls. Now, as the embers flicker low and the imagined rustling in medieval bed stills, we can lean gently into the hush of that second sleep. But before we settle into our own, there's still one curious question whispering through the candle smoke. How on earth did they know when to wake up so precisely in the middle of the night, without clocks? Now, that is a tale worth wandering into next. As midnight murmured across the medieval countryside, something curious unfolded in timber-framed cottages and smoky stone manors alike. Candles burned to little wax ghosts, hearths whispered in embers, and the people, from ploughmen to parish priests, began to rise from their beds, not to go to work or wage war, but to relish the curious hour between sleeps. Yes, we are now deep in the realm of the watch, that starlit stretch of wakefulness betwixt the so-called first and second sleeps. It was a delectable limbo, neither day nor night, action nor idleness, a time when folk weren't quite awake, but certainly not asleep, rather like the last 10 minutes of a history lecture after lunch. During this middle watch, the world grew curiously alive, not loud, never loud, but whisperingly so. This was when the village baker might slip from his blanket, knead dough with rhythmic sighs, and leave it rising like a hibernating badger. The blacksmith would stoke his embers in the dark, muttering to iron like it was a moody toddler. Even monks, heaven help them, would rise from chilly straw mattresses to chant soft Latin in echoey cloisters, serenading the moon. And average folk? Well, many sat cross-legged at the hearth, poking at it with sticks like it owed them rent. Couples whispered beneath woolen covers. A little pillow talk, a little prayer, sometimes both at once. It was said this was the ideal hour for, well, intimacy. Nature's favorite pastime, history's most whispered fact. Really, if ever there were a marketing campaign for segmented sleep, good for babies and confessions might have been it. But it wasn't just about romantic rendezvous or domestic chores. For some, the watch was spiritual. In the stillness, people contemplated their souls, their sins, their unpaid debts to Geoffrey down the lane. The darkness between sleeps held a curious reverence. Without distraction, thoughts tiptoed in like guests at a wake. It was an hour when time itself seemed to slow, pressing its finger to its lips, asking for quiet. And yet, don't mistake this nighttime interlude for frantic productivity. The medieval watch wasn't a coffee-fueled burst of ambition. No one was drawing up blueprints or launching Etsy shops by candlelight. Theirs was a more meandering, meditative sort of wakefulness, like forgetting what you stood up for and deciding to just go with it. Some even read, or were read to, if you were lucky or wealthy, enough to have someone literate in your bedchamber who didn't mind candle wax drips on their nightshirt. Psalters were common, of course, as were saints' lives and the occasional astrological guide recounting why Mars was probably the reason your crops failed and your goat wandered off last Tuesday. But let us not forget the dreamers, those who simply sat awake and watched shadows play on the wall like medieval Netflix. Monks often recorded dreams in their marginalia, scribbling sleepy symbols beside their sermons. Angels with pastry wings, snakes dressed as bishops, and on at least one occasion, a pig lecturing on the virtues of charity. No, really, even outside the world was not completely still. The occasional owl echoed through forested groves, eyes glinting with the unnervingly wise certainty of a being who's seen every village scandal twice. And sometimes you'd hear the clop of clogs on cobblestones. Not ghosts, but night soil men or watchmen or lovers playing chicken with morning. You see, the middle night could feel like a secret, a whispered memo from the cosmos saying, you have time to think, to ponder, to fix the leak in your soul or the one in your thatch, or just to marvel that sleep, like everything else in the Middle Ages, came in convenient servings of two. Gradually, as the stars began to fade and roosters began dreaming of performing again, people returned to bed. Blankets rustled, beds creaked, and silence snuggled back in. The second sleep was coming, heavier, deeper, and perhaps a touch reluctant, like a curtain drawing closed on a secret midnight performance. What came next, under the wink of dawn and the smell of baking bread, was the other half of this curious slumber. A tale with peasants and pancakes and perhaps a philosophical pig or two, waiting softly just beyond first light. As church bells tolled into the deepening dusk of a 14th century evening, turning rust-coloured rooftops into silhouettes, a curious calm settled over medieval towns. Twilight had manners back then. It didn't rush, didn't glare. It stretched itself like a cat warming beside a hearth, letting everything slip into stillness by degrees. Candles were lit painstakingly, one stubby wick at a time, and households took on the hue of honey-soaked parchment. The cotter's cottage, the blacksmith's loft, even the manor house of a petty lord who insisted his moustache was God's own comb. Each flickered with golden light, and it is here, in this gentle medieval gloaming, that the first sleep alighted. You see, when the medieval world tilted into night, it wasn't for a single, uninterrupted 8-hour marathon of unconsciousness. No. They preferred their sleep like a well-composed lute song, in 2 distinct movements. First sleep, then a period of wakefulness, then second sleep, as if the night itself were taking an intermission. What did people do during that time between slumbers, you ask? Well, that's when things get amusing in the most historical sort of way. Some whispered prayers, of course. Not the hasty sort we whisper today when we've stubbed a toe, and remember we haven't spoken to the divine in quite a while. No, these were long, winding reflections steeped in hours of pious pondering. Monks and nuns had entire manuals for midnight devotions, which was probably the closest medieval Europe got to a self-help bestseller. Others used this liminal time with more earthly devotions. Indeed, parish records and medical manuals, which I dare say were always written by men with the gravitas of someone who's never properly discussed digestion, mention the interval as a prime time for couples to connect. Yes, even in those drafty wattle and daub dwellings, beneath layers of wool and whispering thatch, love found its candlelit hour. Best time for conceiving children, wrote a 15th century physician who bore the unfortunate name of Bartholomew the Bald. He argued that the body, rested and sputtering back to life, was neither sluggish with slumber, nor yet seized by the day's burdens. Of course, he also prescribed dried bee legs for shoulder pain, so take that advice as you will. Those not engaged in such intimate pursuits might rise to tend the fire, read by lamplight, if they were literate and affluent, or even sneak out for a neighbourly chat. Imagine it, wearing a fur-trimmed nightcap, clutching a lantern and some strange medieval snack, perhaps a lump of cheese encased in bread like a flowery time capsule. Trotting down the lane at 2 a.m. to ask Geoffrey if he's heard what the miller's youngest did in the pig shed, society's first late-night gossip hour, and for those who awake with minds like flint, always sparking. This was the moment for ideas. Scholars supposedly did some of their best, thinking then. The medieval brain, unjostled by the Gutenberg press or the plague of email, wandered through the dimness like a cat in an attic, soft, curious, and absolutely certain that string was invented for its amusement. Now remember, this wasn't seen as strange. It was simply how things were. The human circadian rhythm, under the governance of natural light, curved gently with sunset and sunrise. First sleep began shortly after darkness fell, typically a couple of hours post-supper. Then came that quiet window, an hour or two of wakefulness, followed by the descent into second sleep, stretching until dawn cracked open the sky in pastel surprise. Even the language tucked it in without question. In French, they called it premier sommeil and second sommeil. Not poetic, perhaps, but certainly matter-of-fact, rather like ordering sleep at a medieval tavern. Ah yes, I'll start with the prime repose, slightly drowsy, and follow with a hearty helping of snooze, hold the nightmares. So, why not just sleep through the night as we do now? Well, that answer unspools wider than a friar's belt after a feast day. But in truth, our modern sleep pattern owes more to factories and fluorescent lights than to our biology. But that is a tale to unfurl gently. perhaps over a warm ale and the soft snores of villagers returning to their second dreams. A tale we shall cradle next, mind you, as the embers of evening sway ever softer and the hush of history draws near. It is a balmy summer night in 1373, and the stars are doing their usual excellent job of glittering quietly above a thatch-roofed house in the English shire of Wiltshire. Inside, nestled under a sagging beam and a ceiling more spider than wood, lives a cooper named Tib. Tib makes barrels by day, makes oatcakes by evening, and, inevitably, like everyone else in his time, makes his way into bed not for one solid sleep, but for two. Ah yes, the curious practice of biphasic sleep. Tib's first slumber began shortly after sunset, once the last embers had sighed their final smoky breath in the hearth, and the cows had been lowed into something resembling agreement. By this point, Tib and his wife Hilda would have curled into their straw-stuffed mattress, armed with a single, limp woolen blanket and the unshakable belief that a lukewarm turnip could cure almost anything. This first sleep, bone-deep and dream-thick, lasted for about 4 hours. This was no nap. This was the serious business of restoration. The chicken-picking, ale-hauling, mud-dodging toil of medieval life left no one with a gentle glow. It left you with an aching back, questionable smells, and very few teeth. But just when modern minds might expect a good 8-hour stretch, something peculiar happened. Around midnight, Tib's eyes fluttered open. Across the room, the hearth had been rekindled to a gentle amber, without a spark of urgency. There was no rush. This waking period, called the watch by those who practiced it, was quiet, humane, and oddly productive. Here, at the velvet center of the night, people like Tib and Hilda didn't lie awake fretting about missed emails or questionable tweets. They used this time gently, sometimes to reflect, sometimes to pray, often to, shall we say, engage in marital diplomacy. Monks used the watch to chant matins. Poets wrote by candlelight, scribbling verses that would eventually get attributed to people far more famous. Midwives visited homes where new lives were stalling, and insomniacs simply admitted they weren't broken. They were just accidentally aligned with history. Tib, like many of his social standing, often reached for what little parchment he owned, usually a stained scrap left over from wrapping last Lent's dried eel, and used charcoal to record barrel measurements or doodle exceedingly poor likenesses of chickens. Hilda might check the herbs drying by the chimney, or slip outside to whisper to the moon while relieving herself in the nettles and scolding yet another tripping goose. Nobody panicked during the middle-of-the-night wakefulness. There were no sleep hygiene podcasts warning you about blue light or the sinful allure of late-night cheese. In fact, cheese very well might have been consumed during the watch, usually soft, possibly suspicious. Why did everyone sleep like this? The reasons, as so many in history are, were partially practical and partially poetic. Before electricity made the night an endless, flickering impostor of day, people followed the rhythms of light like sailors on a tide. The sun dipped below the horizon, and so did eyelids. And in a pre-industrial world, where the threat of spontaneous cowbirth or casual Viking reappearance kept folks on their toes, having 2 shifts of sleep offered a modicum of flexibility for both productivity and self-preservation. Doctors of the age, when they weren't prescribing leeches for a stubbed toe, actually considered the watch to be healthful, a sort of digestive half-time that allowed the body's humours to realign, like sleepy ballroom dancers. And so, in this softly glowing midnight, Tib poured a tin mug of ale, stifled a hiccup, and rubbed his feet by the coals. Sometime later, Hilda braided garlic into the rafters, a charming ritual against both bad spirits and bad breath. Then, without ceremony, the second sleep would come. Not with a start, but with a sigh. The bed welcomed them back like an old friend who never locked the door. And that second sleep, that deep and silent return to dreaming, carried them onward till the cockerel's first smart alecky crow at dawn. Some said the second sleep was lighter, more lucid. Others claimed it held the best dreams, the ones where bread never ran out and fish hurled themselves willingly into your basket. And somewhere in that quiet, stitched between two slumbers like a bookmark in the night, was the medieval soul at peace, not hurrying, not hustling, just resting exactly as the world once did. In the hush before dawn, with sleep descending again like the closing of a velvet curtain, it's time we pulled the covers higher and dimmed the candlelight even further, because there's still something stirring in the dark, waiting patiently for a new chapter to awaken. As the townsfolk of medieval Europe shuffled off to their first sleep, candles snuffed, shutters drawn tight against the sighing wind, life didn't so much stop as it quietly rearranged itself. Homes and hearts settled, embers whispered under ash, and those ancient straw-stuffed mattresses creaked under the weight of dreams not yet finished. But somewhere between the midnight chime of the village bell and the rooster's misplaced warm-up crow, something remarkable tended to happen. People woke up, voluntarily, and not because they accidentally rolled into the cat or realized they dreamed themselves into a ditch full of tax collectors. No, this moment of waking between the first sleep and the second was expected, understood, almost treasured. In many households, it became a liminal hour. Not quite today, not quite tomorrow. Lamps were lit, sighs breathed out. Some sat in silence, their minds drifting like autumn leaves across their bed sheets. Others reached for prayer books or each other. And yes, marital obligations were frequently fulfilled in these hour or so intervals, but let's keep things proper. It was a time when many kinds of intimacy were shared. Storytelling, confessions, bread, arguments about who used up all the firewood. Oddly enough, this waking period wasn't treated as an interruption. Rather, it hovered in the collective rhythm of the day like a well-earned comma in the long sentence of human existence. It was simply what people did, like churning butter, mistrusting the French, or believing turnips could cause moral decay if eaten on Wednesdays. That last one may not be historically documented, but it feels spiritually accurate. Records from the time, letters, religious treatises, and physicians' notes penned in the crabby Latin of monks needing more ink and less piety refer quite plainly to these episodes. They called it first sleep and second sleep, as if slumber came in tree rings. There were guides that advised writers to do their best thinking in the waking hour between sleeps, because apparently that's when one's spleen was least vengeful and the mind most attuned to the musings of saints and livestock. Imagine the scene. A modest timber-framed cottage glowing with the soft flicker of a torch. A woman sits with needle in hand, repairing a cloak by firelight. Somewhere behind her, her husband murmurs something drowsily philosophical like, "Do you think geese judge us?" A child stirs and then settles again. Outside, the wind rustles past bare branches as the stars, long unbothered by artificial light, glitter with prehistoric confidence overhead. There's no alarm clock, just the shadowy hush of time moving slowly enough to notice. This gentle breach between sleeps also served more practical purposes. In the agricultural calendar, certain tasks were squeezed into this nocturnal window. checking on livestock during lambing season, baking that morning's bread without waking the cranky thatcher next door. And for those off the farm but on the fence, it was a time when dreams could be examined, interpreted, or at the very least, politely laughed at over ale. Not everyone, mind you, was thrilled. Some grumbled that the waking hour led to laziness or impure thoughts, or worse, knitting in the dark. But for the most part, the culture simply flowed with the jewel tides of nightly rest. You see, back in a time before electric light and endless scrolling, and by scrolling, I mean unrolling parchments of questionable poetry, people weren't rushing towards slumber so much as swaying with it. Sleep was not a race. It was a ceremony with an intermission. As we drift now into quieter thoughts, you might hear the faint, far-off creak of a wooden bed settling under a stirring sleeper. Through the candle-lit stillness, the middle hours play their soft part, guiding our chimerical ancestors from one sleep to the next. And if you're wondering what exactly people did during that stretch of wakeful twilight, whether they baked, read, or simply stared at the hearth with a vague sense of holy confusion, well, that's a little door we'll creak open in just a moment, somewhere around the year 1325, in a village that wasn't on any map and wouldn't stay on one even if you tried, thanks to goats who kept eating the parchment. There lived an old weaver named Osric, whose sleep habits were about as tangled as his worst tapestries. He slept like a typical medieval man of the cloth, and then woke up like a man who just remembered he forgot to pray, feed the pig, or settle a minor blood feud. You see, in those ancient pre-electricity times, the nights were long. Not just long in the yawning, sleepy sense, though certainly that too, but long in sheer hours of darkness. In the depths of winter, people had a good 14 to 16 hours of gloom stretching before them, and the candle economy made sure you didn't want to burn wax through all of it. So folks did something modern humans find vaguely scandalous. They went to bed early, woke up for a couple of hours in the middle of the night, and then went back to bed again. Osric was thoroughly in on this strange two-part slumber. His first sleep usually started around sunset, give or take the time it took to tell his grandchildren a bedtime story that may or may not have involved mildly threatening goblins and an aggressive turnip. After a few hours of peaceful snoring that sounded like crumpling scrolls, Osric would stir sometime around midnight. He'd awaken not in a panic, nor from a nightmare, but with the serene awareness that it was precisely the right moment to be half awake. This interlude between sleeps was known in those days as the watch, which sounds ominous, but mostly involved things like poking at the fire, whispering a few prayers, nibbling on leftover pottage, and occasionally having a mild existential crisis about whether he'd remembered to collect enough wool for next week's market. Some folks used the watch for far nobler pursuits. Monks prayed, scholars read, philosophers philosophized, and human beings, being human, occasionally made more human beings. It wasn't uncommon for this midnight stirring to be a rather social affair. Visiting a neighbor during the watch wasn't bizarre. It was borderline respectable. Imagine ringing someone's bell in the middle of the night today just to discuss cabbages or latest gossip about the blacksmith's daughter. Back then, perfectly acceptable, very homey. In Osric's cottage, the watch was quiet. He'd shuffle about in his woolen socks, throw a bit more dried moss onto the hearth for light, and sit thoughtfully as if pondering the deep mysteries of the universe, though mostly he was just wondering why his left knee always hurt when it rained. The experience was not restless, but rather contemplative, like a soft, pause in the symphony of night. A pause society had lost by rushing straight from sunset to sunrise with no room in between for slow thoughts and sleepy pondering. Contrary to modern assumptions, this wasn't a universal curse of insomnia, nor a result of too much mead before bed. This segmented sleep was the norm for centuries. Practitioners of the soft science of historical bedtime, known as historians, have uncovered countless references in journals, religious texts, and physician manuals to this first sleep and second sleep pattern. Even the good doctors of the day chimed in with gentle encouragement, noting that the hours between sleeps were ideal for digestion, and ideally, digestion that didn't end in an herbal purgative. One 15th century French medical manual even recommended taking a short walk in the garden during the watch, which was probably more poetic advice than practical, given that it was mid-January and the garden was full of frozen beets. Over time, this nocturnal pause became a quaint backdrop to rural life. A mother might use it to check on her sleeping children. A farmer might mend a broken strap by the firelight. A priest might jot down a few sermon thoughts before dozing off again in his hay-filled corner. And Osric, dearest Osric, might quietly undo a few terrible weaving knots by touch alone, all while humming a tune that hadn't had lyrics in 2 generations. What changed, of course, was the light. Oh, but we're drifting ahead of ourselves now, like a drowsy candle melting off its wick. For now, let the fire in Osric's hearth flicker gently, and imagine that quiet in-between hour, time unhurried, a world half asleep, with only the soft susurrus of wind through the shutters. And as the embers glow and the yawns begin anew, we settle down with Osric once more. Just as he begins his second softer sleep, let us drift now into the hushed stillness of medieval bedrooms once again. Those candle-scented chambers tucked behind heavy oak doors, where quilts puffed like clouds atop straw-stuffed mattresses, and nighttime was more of a 2-part play than a singular slumber. Our scene this evening takes us into the radiant glow of a quiet space between sleeps, the lovely limbo of the watch, that mysterious hour or two when folks, having stirred from first sleep, occupied themselves with little rituals, odd habits, and perhaps the rare noble art of whispering into the darkness about sheep and shoes and second breakfast. Now, this intersleep interlude was considered perfectly normal by our medieval ancestors. No one was panicking in bed, eyes wide, wondering why sleep had evaded them. No, they would have sat up in bed with the nonchalance of someone waking from a midday nap, only instead of checking their devices, since the only evil rectangles they had were the suspiciously small windows. They might have reached for a bit of kindling to relight the hearth, or squinted over toward their chamber pot, contemplating whether it had teleported mysteriously farther away. This waking period was called, delightfully, the watch. People used it for all sorts of things: praying, meditating, philosophizing about pigs, or even visiting neighbors if the moonlight was just right and one had the appropriate cloak-parka hybrid for nocturnal strolls. Some took this opportunity for, shall we say, romantic activities, though medieval beds were rarely the stuff of alluring poetry. They creaked mightily. And let's just say that hygiene wasn't exactly lighting the room on fire, although sometimes literally it was. But truth be told, many used the watch for more tender endeavors. Parents would soothe a baby, or perhaps quietly sew by the pale shimmer of rushlight. Letters got written. Bread was checked on. Cabbages were pondered. In monasteries, monks followed this middle-of-the-night vigil routinely, rising from stone-hard pallets to chant, pray, and do mysterious monk things like contemplate the meaning of goats. And here's the curious thing. They didn't resent this waking. They didn't see it as insomnia, because to them, it wasn't. It was simply how night worked. Sleep came in generous halves, and nestled between them was a quiet window for peace, reflection, or a little light sinning, depending on one's inclination and access to mulled ale. Even doctors of the time recommended this pattern. The 13th century physician Arnold of Villanova noted that the sleep which is taken in the first part of the night is more beneficial for digestion, while the second allowed for a clearer head. In other words, waking peacefully before round 2 of snoozing was considered not only natural, but medicinal, like herbal tea or shouting out at a ghost. The common consensus was that the body, like bread dough or gossip, requires time to rest, breathe, and rise. And that meant pressing pause somewhere in the middle of the night for a few fuzzy minutes or a full hour or two. Nobody worried that they were broken. There was no anxiety-inducing article titled, "Why You're Only Getting One Sleep Per Night, and It's Slowly Destroying You." Instead, there was acceptance, and dim lamps, and perhaps a slice of cheese. Now imagine lying there nestled in linen or, if you were lucky, wool imported from Flanders. Maybe your mind drifted to your family, or to yesterday's market gossip, or how many turnips you could reasonably ferment before your shed began to mutter. That crevice of night between sleeps became a gentle interlude in the concert of slumber, neither fully awake nor asleep, just comfortably adrift. Eventually, your body would remind you that the second sleep was due, and as the embers cooled and the sparrows outside dared not yet chirp, you'd pull your covers to your chin, yawn a bit like a confused owl, and fall once again into that profound velvety darkness. For now, second sleep awaited, a gentle descent into dreams of meadows, miracles, and moss-covered bread. And speaking of bread and the passage of time, the morning looms ever so faintly on the horizon. But before it arrives, there's one more slice of nighttime life we must butter warmly. As winter dusk wrapped its indigo shawl over the rooftops of medieval towns, a strange hush would settle over cobbled lanes and quiet hearths alike. It was neither day nor true night. This was the edge of the first sleep, that peculiar medieval custom where folks went to bed not once, but twice. And nestled snugly between those two sleep sessions lay an hour or two of midnight waking, a dreamy interlude rich with slow conversations, quiet prayer, and, on occasion, some impressively inefficient indoor candle whittling. But tonight, we peek behind the heavy oak door of a thatch-roofed household, where the fire has settled into a vague orange glow and shadows are gently rehearsing their choreography on lime-washed walls. Everyone within has just awakened from their first sleep, and the air hums with that sluggish charm unique to waking up when no one's expecting you to. A man named Oswin, artisanal turnip farmer, semi-amateur beekeeper, and dedicated nap enthusiast, shuffles toward the hearth in his woolen nightrobe, which was remarkably similar to his daytime robe, though he insists the embroidery spells slumber. He rubs his eyes and gives a yawn so deep, even the cat yawns in sympathy. This time, between sleeps, known charmingly in olden parlance as the watch, was surprisingly productive. It's when medieval folks performed tasks that required neither sunlight nor heavy lifting. Things like reading scripture, whispering spicy gossip about the blacksmith's apprentice, or quietly reflecting upon the many and varied meanings of a dream involving a goose wearing a crown. In monastic communities, this interlude was not just encouraged, it was scheduled. Monks, like bleary-eyed alarm clocks devoted to God, would awaken at midnight for matins, a service that involved chanting in Latin, modest bowing, and likely trying not to trip over Brother Anselm's trailing cassock. And though we might imagine the medieval peasantry to be too busy with their daylight labours to entertain philosophical ponderings in the moonlit hours, one must only peruse an old almanac or court record to discover that this between sleep time became a cherished space. Couples, newly undrowsy from a few hours of slumber, might whisper sweet nothings or argue gently about whether the cow was making judging noises again. It was also a social hour, albeit an eerily hushed one. Neighbours, if they shared a wall thin enough or a fire warm enough, sometimes whispered stories or even knocked on each other's doors with offerings of ale or questions about that weird sound heard near the compost heap. Very social, in a limited-range pre-electrical way. By candlelight or moonbeam poking through wood-shuttered windows, this liminal space became a kind of psychological waiting room, no longer fully tethered to the waking world, but not yet surrendered to dreams either. And in this quiet crack between sleeps, people often described feeling more clear-headed, as though the fog of fatigue had lifted just enough to allow contemplation or creativity. Some even wrote during these hours. Yes, quills scratching lightly in candlelight, breathing woolen gratitude into a quiet house. Medieval physician Ibn Butlan once noted, quite helpfully, that this middle-of-the-night waking allowed for better digestion, which is probably the only medical advice in history that celebrates waking up at midnight just to burp strategically. But perhaps the most fascinating part about this nocturnal hiatus is not what people did, but how natural it all felt. Without modern lighting to trick the brain into a continuous, coffee-fueled marathon of wakefulness, the body aligned itself beautifully with darkness and silence. Our very biology lent itself to segmented slumber. One sleep, a pause, then the other. Scholars suggest melatonin levels would rise, dip, and then rise again, gently nudging people through this rhythm, like a cow nudging its sleep-deprived farmer toward breakfast. So as Oswin rises to step outside for just a moment, ostensibly to check if the moon looks suspicious, but really because he's just restless, he gazes out onto a world so still, so silvered by frost, that even time seems to yawn. In that space between sleeps, the landscape breathes slowly, and people, for once, breathe with it. An hour or two more, and the second sleep will come like a soft wave. The hearth will settle into ash. The dreams will resume their peculiar logic, and the first hints of dawn will peek over the sheep-dotted hill. But before all that, as Oswin and the cat return to bed, one curling, one stretching, we'll leave them there, just beginning to drift. And perhaps, in this soft, somnolent moment, we might look in on another restless soul by candlelight, preparing for their own return to dreams. While most of us today tumble into our beds and expect to remain comatose until our alarm blares, medieval folk had a more intermission-friendly approach to nighttime. So let's return now to that curious candlelit window between first and second sleep, an age when the night itself came in 2 acts, with a curious little interlude that could last an hour or more. Now you might be wondering, what did people do during this groggy halftime show of the night? Well, brace yourself, because the answer is everything and nothing. Some simply lay still, pondering sermons, sheep, or stews. Others took the moment to relieve themselves, both in terms of bladder and soul, paid a quick visit to the chamber pot, and then prayed to balance the ledger. But there were also the more industrious sorts. Letters were written, Bread was kneaded, fires gingerly stoked, and some even engaged in the odd midnight chat with a spouse, or, in more daring circles, a neighbour. Monks, of course, used the break to chant matins, which sounds holy, and was holy, but arguably also a fine excuse to wander about cloaked in darkness, thumbing sacred texts and muttering in Latin. And in townhouses, you might hear the faint rustle of someone cracking open a book. Yes, books, illuminated and expensive, were read in the midnight lull, especially among the literate elite. These handwritten tomes were so precious they might be chained to the furniture, which might just add weight to your midnight ponderings. Interestingly enough, this gap between sleeps was known as the watch in some parts. Rather poetic, isn't it? It sounds like something noble. As if each sleepy soul had been assigned their own vigil over the silent world. In truth, many simply sat in bed, staring at a low-burning candle stub, their thoughts probably drifting from sin to supper to why Father Geoffrey smelled faintly of wet hay. Medical texts of the time even recommended this little nocturnal pause. The 13th century scholar Bartholomeus Anglicus, which incidentally is not a magical incantation but a man's actual name, claimed that sleep was best when taken in 2 morsels, like a fine meal. It helped digestion, cooled the humours, and generally kept one's internal winds from turning wrathful. Being gassy was thought to provoke melancholy and sermons, so night pacing perhaps saved the soul. And the air. Even 15th century physicians believed that the body was not meant to sleep in one unbroken lump. You see, they thought the first sleep healed the body, and the second helped the spirit. This patchy sort of rest made sense in a world paced by the rising and setting of the sun, not by buzzing phones or double-pane windows. But our story takes an even curiouser turn when we follow the folk who didn't so much pause between sleeps as party. There are delightful records, tangled in footnotes and linen, indicating that some households use the interlude for marital intimacy. The textual evidence, written with blushing ink, suggests that this window of time was prime for, well, cozy reconnection. One text even calls it the best time to conceive, which sounds delightfully like a scheduling tip from a medieval fertility app. And while some were stirring in shadowed stillness, farmers might take to occasionally checking on their livestock. A hen might be brooding oddly, or a cow might be dreaming aggressively. The rhythm of night was shared by beasts and humans alike. In fact, we suspect some goats participated in second sleep, or at least got offended when milkmaids didn't. Over time, urban life and the Industrial Revolution conspired to compress sleep into one tidy stretch. Artificial light crept in, street lamps sprouted like luminous mushrooms, and midnight became less an intermission and more of a deadline. Our two-sleep heritage faded like fog at dawn. But in this chapter of history, in this sleepy nook of time, night itself was a form of art, layered, paced, reflective, to rest not once but twice, with a thoughtful yawn in between. A ritual lost in the tick-tock of our modern clocks, but perhaps still flickering in our instinct to wake at 2 a.m. and wonder why. And if you close your eyes carefully now, you can almost hear the quiet rustle of quills, the whisper of prayer, a sheep shifting in its stall, and the hush of a kindly world somewhere between first and second sleep, which leads us, like a soft footstep on a creaky stair, into what happened next in those remaining hours before the rooster crowed. The moon had long passed its peak in the night sky, glowing faintly like a pearl dropped onto velvet, and the streets of medieval towns were now cloaked in stillness, except, perhaps, for the soft slosh of a chamber pot being emptied out a second-story window. But within the modest cottages of common folk, flickers of candlelight reawakened, not for prayer nor for plunder, but for something far more peculiar. The in-between time. Yes, between the first sleep and the second sleep, there was an interlude, a strange twilight of wakefulness tucked neatly between two slumbering chapters. Think of it as the ancient version of a midnight snack, just with fewer Pop-Tarts and more pottage. This brief window, often an hour or two, was less a disruption and more a feature. And in this pocket of time, people did all sorts of surprisingly productive things. One might stoke the hearth and heat goat's milk. Another might visit a neighbor for a quiet chat, though one does wonder how much of that was gossip in a nightgown. Monks, ever the overachievers, would chant nocturnal psalms, and some even believed the devil was weakest during these hours, ideal for holy contemplation, or, if you weren't too pious or too sleepy, for marital intimacy. Yes, midnight romance had quite a reputation. Medical texts from the time actually advised couples that the in-between wakefulness was, quote, a most favorable time for begetting children. Apparently, nothing says irresistible like groggily searching the floor for your nightcap in candlelight. But let's not reduce it all to candlelit canoodling. Books were read during the interlude, diaries written. Some folks even took the opportunity to reflect on dreams from the first sleep, sharing them like ancient tweets, but with more symbolic horses and fewer hashtags. There's a curious letter from the 15th century philosopher Thomas Tryon, who casually mentions strolling around his home after midnight to consider the stars and tender my thoughts to heaven. Certainly one way of saying he couldn't get back to sleep. In manor houses, noblewomen might spin or sew under the safe glow of a lamp. This temporal oasis, neither fully day nor wholly night, was oddly democratic. Lords and peasants alike participated, often unaware that centuries later, scientists would stumble upon this forgotten pattern and give it a very unromantic name: segmented sleep. But picture it. After long days of toil and frostbitten fingers, your eyes flutter closed after supper. You sleep deeply for 4 hours, then awaken not to an alarm, but because your body simply rises. It's dark, quiet, the world at its pause. You sit by the warm embers, sip a sip of warmed ale, and ponder things. How did my cabbages do today? Did the chickens look me in the eye oddly? What is a soul? Questions of existential significance mingled with barnyard logistics. And yet, the interlude wasn't just for reflection or productivity. Some saw it as a spiritual window, liminal time when the veil between world and divine felt slightly thinner. A humbling hour. Imagine lying back, woolen blanket drawn to your chin, listening to the low hoot of an owl outside, wondering if dreams were messages from another realm, or just odd stories your brain insisted on retelling with alarming plot holes. Oddly enough, the church was ambivalently fond of this wakeful time. On one hand, the in-between hours were ideal for nocturnal prayers, especially among monks. The divine office had built-in midnight sessions, ensuring no one ever truly got 8 hours of sacred slumber. On the other hand, bishops grumbled that middling peasants were using the second sleep interlude for activities of dubious morality. Unlicensed midwives, cups of beer passed beneath doors, suspicious muffled lute music. You know, the usual. Of course, not all midnight activities were so curious. Some simply sat in silence. No phones, no glow of screens, just the soft crackle of a hearth and time to breathe. If history gives us anything in the quiet hours, it's the reminder that sometimes doing nothing at all is a deeply cultivated skill. One could say medieval folks were light years ahead of today's mindfulness trends, minus the yoga mats and lavender-scented eye pillows. And when the clock, which they rarely checked, nudged toward morning, they'd return to bed for that sweet, sleepy second sleep. A return not just to dreams, but to the tail end of the night's curtain call. Now, as we stretch our toes deeper into this historical quilt of forgotten rhythms, let's tiptoe even further into the dawn-dusted edge of their nightly world. The candles had long burned down to stubborn nubs. In a stone cottage, somewhere in the 15th century, a baker's wife stirred from her first sleep, rubbed her eyes with hands dusted in rye flour, and rose without complaint. She wouldn't have called herself sleep-deprived. No, this was simply when the dream intermission began. If you find the modern world's 8-hour uninterrupted sleep rule to be a bit authoritarian, you're in good company. Medieval sleepers preferred the double feature: first sleep, then waking rest, followed by second sleep. No screen time, no fitness trackers wagging digital fingers, just the natural rhythm of bodies syncing with the sun and moon, like a pair of lute strings. This wakeful gap between the two sleeps, often lasting an hour or more, was something of a golden hour, though far too dimly lit to be photogenic. It wasn't a time cursed by insomnia, but rather embraced as intermission. Pause for a cup of warmed ale, chat with whoever shared your straw mattress, mutter a few prayers, or, in some monastic settings, chant psalms in ghostly Latin with the kind of enthusiasm only sleepwalkers can conjure. But not all midnight rituals were so pious. Many parishioners use this wakeful stretch for what we'll delicately describe as marital diplomacy. Monastic writers, unsurprisingly, frowned on this. Thomas Aquinas once warned that too much bedroom rendezvous during the wakeful gap might leave one too drowsy come morning prayers, which is, in medieval terms, the closest thing to relationship advice from a man who wore robes full time. This quiet midnight span was also a fine moment for reflection, more meditative than a modern mindfulness app, and blessedly free of subscription fees. People might silently review their dreams that, at the time, were not whimsical nonsense, but laden with possible divine messages, ominous warnings, or, at the very least, entertaining subconscious appearances by their landlord dressed as a goose. Books were a luxury in the Middle Ages, but if someone had access, they might pluck one from the shelf during this hush. Imagine nestling into a thick woolen blanket, candle sputtering shadows across a sheepskin page, as you read tales of saints or scandalous histories of ancient emperors who did not sleep nearly enough. Agricultural texts of the day wisely advise farmers to rise and examine their animals in the middle of the night, especially childbirth-prone cows. One Greek manual suggested that checking on livestock in dream-filtered hourglass light improved herd health. Whether this was true or the result of generations of very bored shepherds is still up for academic debate. Then there were the clever ones, the thinkers and tinkerers, who found the midnight hour fertile ground for invention. Segmented sleep let the mind stretch in ways linear wakefulness wouldn't allow. Leonardo da Vinci, centuries later, still dabbled in this polyphasic sleep style and likely spent his midnight hours sketching helicopters before blithely rolling into nap number 17. But perhaps the most delightful discovery emerging from this sleep duet custom was the social aspect. There are recorded instances of neighbors whispering greetings through thin wooden walls, or even meeting in shared courtyards for hushed conversations and spiced wine. The only thing missing was a podcast. Ironically, though you might say predictably, the Industrial Revolution barreled in like an over-caffeinated blacksmith and put an end to all this elegant night waking. Shift work, factory bells, and gaslight hours squashed the intersleep pause flatter than a badly baked pottage. And so, the dreamy discussions, moonlit musings, and impromptu midnight baking sessions gently faded from common practice, retreating into the arms of historians and poets. Still, somewhere in the warm nook of the human brain that remembers things it never lived, the two-sleep rhythm lingers, a deep ancestral sigh between yawns. Some modern folk are quietly rediscovering it, embracing segmented sleep as a cozy rebellion against the tyranny of electric clocks. And so, as our candle flickers once more and casts a crescent shadow across your pillow, we inch toward the coziest corners of the medieval home, the bed itself. But before we drift beneath those feather-stuffed coverlets, there's one more layer worth peeking under. While the world slumbers beneath quilts and stars, we drift quietly now to the bedroom habits of the not-so-modern man. Somewhere around the 13th century, in a cold stone room dimly lit by the ember glow of last night's firewood, a woolen-wrapped figure blinked awake. It was about midnight, and it was time for their nightly intermission. Yes, like a good 5-act play, or a very long church service with an enthusiastic choir, sleep in the Middle Ages often came in two halves. Stretch, sip some ale, whisper a prayer, consider the sins. Then it's back to bed for round 2. But in the middle, that's where the story cocooned. The curious interlude was called the watch, and it was far from idle. For those anointed night owls of centuries past, this was a sacred slot of time, smuggled between two dreams, kind of like sneaking down to the kitchen at 3 a.m. for a snack, except your snack might be psalms, stargazing, or, let's be honest, a little mischief. In this chapter of Shadowed Hours, the medieval world was quietly buzzing. Monks serenely chanted in candlelit cloisters. Peasants turned their thoughts to God, or gossiped in hushed voices under straw-thatched roofs. Some couples famously used the space between sleeps for intimacy, written about not just in folklore, but in actual marital advice manuals, which existed and were often disturbing, and made the modern reader wish they hadn't peeked. But still, how romantic, until you remember the lack of hygiene and pervasive smell of onions. Everybody smelled like onions in medieval Europe. It was the perfume of the peasantry. This curious sleep half-time wasn't just reserved for peasants or nuns. It popped up in the rambling diaries of scholars, in the notarial scraps of lawyers, and even in the private letters of nobles. The poet Chaucer knew of it. The physician Thomas Cogan gently whispered of its health benefits, and a few overachieving bishops likely justified an extra helping of stew during their late wakes because the Lord sees my hunger. It wasn't insomnia, you see. It was woven into nightly routine like a sock darning itself in the dark. First sleep might begin not long after dusk, say around 8:30 p.m, and run until midnight or a little after. Then came that delicious wakeful gap, often lasting an hour or two before drifting back into what they called, wait for it, second sleep. Imaginative, weren't they? This in-between time wasn't always silent and solitary, though. In town centres, the night watch might be patrolling with rusted halberds, muttering about suspicious cats. In taverns, landlords might be tossing out patrons lingering too long after ale curfew. And in nobler homes, Servants might be tightening window shutters or poking the fire back into life, tiptoeing as if they weren't the real bosses of the house. For the devout, this window was a golden hour, or golden hour and a half, for prayer. Many religious texts recommended this spiritual interval. Certain psalms were even earmarked for the midnight vigil, like a medieval Spotify playlist, Hits for Hollow Hours, featuring Psalm 63 and the soft snoring of Brother Jeff. And the mind was a peculiar thing at this hour. People reported richer dreams, deeper thoughts, sudden inventive revelations. Perhaps it's no surprise this dreamy wedge of time grew into more than a habit. It became for some a shortcut to clarity, a kind of dimly lit enlightenment that came only when all the stew had settled. But with the rise of industrial timekeeping, clocks that ticked you toward morning like tiny fingernails of tyranny, this beautiful human rhythm began to fade. Lanterns gave way to gaslight, gave way to bulbs, and the cultural permission to rest twice was filed away beneath quaint, pre-electric nonsense, and ultimately forgotten. Until now, when you're lying here with the flicker of your device dancing on the ceiling, and a restless poppy seed of curiosity blooming in your mind. Maybe you've woken up at 2 a.m. before and wondered if you were broken. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're just wonderfully, historically aligned. Stretch your hand toward the bedside glass of water, just for fun. Pretend it's a goblet of ale. The candle next to it. Electric, of course. But imagining otherwise is half the joy. We'll slip deeper into the dream soon, with the hush of haylofts and the rhythm of cathedral bells. For now, settle into your watch, gentle listener, your midnight reprieve. The next verse of our sleepy medieval lullaby is just over the horizon, somewhere in the back corners of a medieval village, where the thatched cottages snuggled sleepy under the stars and the cows grumbled philosophical moo thoughts in their dreams. The people were waking up. For the second time. Not for the day, mind you, just for a bit. Somewhere between their first sleep and second sleep, the world of the night lit up with curious purpose. This little mystical intermission, somewhere around midnight, wasn't some eerie nocturnal haunting. It was just inter-sleep recreation. Chop wood, say your prayers, plot against your neighbour's chicken coop, whatever tickled your candlelit fancy. Now, historians call it the watch or the waking. Medieval folks didn't have alarm clocks, but their bladders and biological rhythms did the job just fine. Sleep wasn't a complete dead zone like we treat it today. It was more like a 2-part series, with a bonus episode in the middle. By this time of night, this hush-soft, eerie moment between sleeps, many would rise quietly. A candle here, a mumble of Latin there. Maybe old Roger would poke at the embers and throw on a log. Maybe Matilda would lace up her boots to check the stew, muttering about how second sleep dreams always predicted the weather. Which they didn't, of course. But you couldn't convince Matilda otherwise. Priests used this time to pray matins, the midnight poetry slam of the monastic world. One can only imagine a group of monks, half asleep, graciously murmuring psalms, while trying not to fall face first into the altar. Truly, the original sleepwalking podcast. And let's not forget the romantically inclined. Between their first and second sleeps, lovers whispered dreams into the darkness, or, more likely, plotted how exactly they'd convince the local baker to feed them 2 buns for the price of 1. It was also a popular time for, well, producing more medieval people. The theory being that the body, freshly rested from first sleep, was apparently more inclined to romance than in the groggy dregs of proper morning. Which, to be honest, remains relatable. Even the cheerfully grumpy village doctor might have strapped on his shoes during this nocturnal break, checking on a patient, brewing up an herbal remedy, or simply pacing and muttering about how he dreamed someone stubbed a toe, and now it's plague. Books, if one could read them and afford them, were sometimes consulted during this midnight window. Not that most villagers could read, but that never stopped Harold the Cooper from pretending. He'd open his one very blank book and squint meaningfully at it until someone gave him credit. And of course, there were those who simply sat by the hearth, watching flames like tiny suns perform slow ballets, letting thoughts drift like lazy smoke up to the rafters. Fireside breaths and idle thoughts. Simple scenes that history doesn't write down, but sleep remembers. Even the architecture joined in. Bedrooms, if people were lucky enough to have them, were built over kitchens to steal warmth from the hearth below. Multiple people filled those beds. This wasn't strange, it was efficiency. It may have been siblings, parents, children, even a stray piglet or two. Honestly, you haven't truly known discomfort until you've tried to sleep while a pig snores on your feet. Cozy in theory, sweaty in practice. Those in castles had slightly more privacy, but also more draught. A stone tower is excellent for defense, less so for mid-January naps. Thick tapestries hung on the walls, not just to decorate, but to keep the cold from climbing directly into one's bones. And if you were very noble indeed, you might retire to a canopied bed. Not for style, but to keep the spiders from dropping in unannounced. It's important to remember that in those long stretches of dim candlelight and ember glow, with quiet shuffles and sighs, people still thought as we do. They worried, they hoped, they remembered. And sometimes they just enjoyed the stillness, the pause, the moment between dreams. Soon, the second sleep would arrive. Slowly. Their bodies would know it was time to melt back into mattresses stuffed with straw or heather or, in rare luxurious cases, feathers that didn't poke through and stab you in the ribs. But for now, the night was awake. Just a little. Just enough for a breath between dreams. And in that hush, between the rise and fall of the fire's lullaby, something new starts to stir. A whisper of dawn, perhaps, or a mystery still tiptoeing through the shadows. As midnight blanketed the medieval countryside, silence settled over the thatched rooftops of sleeping villages, except, of course, for the occasional cow sharing an opinion, or the sound of Brother Thomas tripping over his own sandals on his way to check the monastery's cheese inventory. But for most souls tucked under woolen blankets or bundled straw, this was the interlude, the delicious and ancient dance between two sleeps, the mysterious period known as the watch, a liminal space between first sleep and second sleep, where time politely loosened its corset and decided not to take itself so seriously. People didn't merely drift back to slumber during this pre-dawn lull. No, they lived in the soft glow of the in-between. Some prayed, whispering devotions in candlelight with the quiet pace of someone who just remembered they promised to be pious. Some, like Mistress Annabel of Lower Tittleton, used the time to mend her stockings and interrogate her cat. Others engaged in more marital activities, leading one 15th century medical manual to cheerfully claim that conception was most successful between sleeps. Take that, modern calendars. But perhaps the most enchanting thing about segmented sleep, besides the blissful chance for a snack, was how intimately it wove itself into the rhythm of the day. You see, before mechanical clocks and the tyranny of 9 to 5, time was felt rather than measured. The stars nudged your instincts, oil lamps flickered you toward your next move, And roosters, well, roosters yelled whether you wanted them to or not. The gap between sleeps was a time for introspection, for those drifting thoughts that rarely find a foothold during daylight. Now, dear listener, that may sound awfully poetic, but remember, this was also a time when water pipes weren't a thing and chamber pots were far too familiar. Introspection was often conducted with a shawl around your shoulders and the creeping chill of an English winter nibbling at your toes. By the 17th century, this centuries-old habit had become so normal that people barely talked about it. Much like you don't see many people enthusiastically chatting about brushing their teeth unless they're trapped at a very boring dinner party. Even prominent thinkers of the era referenced first sleep and second sleep in passing, as though everyone simply knew that waking up for an hour or two in the night was just what people did. There was something quietly delightful about the cultural assumptions nestled within the night. Writers penned letters or poetry during this time, their quills scratching away in candlelit corners. Night watchers roamed the streets of cities, calling out the hour. And if you're wondering how accurate they were, imagine a man with a lantern, slightly cold and possibly a bit cross-eyed after too much mead, trying to squint at the moon. Time was estimative at best, and so the night had texture, it had stages. Just as a medieval feast had courses, first salt, then rabbit, then something involving boar and regrets, so too did the night arrive in parts. To leap from evening straight into morning would be like skipping the soup at a banquet. Entire hours of experience would be lost. The quiet murmurs in shared beds, the soft surprise of a midnight thought, the patient threading of a needle by firelight while someone in the corner tried to remember all the verses to Suma is Ikemen in. But change, like an ill-behaved goose, was inevitable. By the Industrial Revolution, factories had replaced fields, candles gave way to gaslights, and the night no longer wore velvet but polyester. Suddenly, people were expected to be awake when told and asleep on schedule. Unnatural punctuality enforced not by stars, but by bells, whistles, and the increasingly loud tick of standardized clocks. First and second sleeps began to vanish, tucked away like an old family recipe, or a particularly embarrassing law about hedgehog parades. And yet, even now, in our world of scrolling screens and midnight snacks, some people still wake in the wee hours with no alarm to blame. A pause in the darkness, not quite awake, not quite asleep. Echoes, perhaps, of an ancient rhythm still stubbornly humming beneath our modern lives. But what, dear dreamer, finally led to the decline of this sleepy duet? Was it simply the speed of progress, a cultural forgetting, or something more curious still? Let's let the night unfold its answer. Gently, as only dreams can whisper, in the flickering hush of medieval twilight, as hearth fires mellowed into glowing embers and the cloisters of evening curled around humble rooftops, the people of the Middle Ages edged closer to their second sleep. The night had split itself neatly in half again, like a loaf of dark bread shared between dreams, a first sleep for shedding the day, and a second for gathering up the morning. And between these sleeps, a curious in-between hour or two that somehow held its own quiet magic, like the delicate silence of a string plucked and still quivering. Monks used this interval for prayer, of course, matins, chanted in the dark, drifting up the abbey walls like smoke from beeswax candles. Entries in 9th century Carolingian monastic rules insisted this early hour was made for whispering holy poetry to the stone walls and stars alike. The Benedictines, never ones to squander time or gruel, believed the hours before dawn were sacred and brimming with clarity, possibly because it was too dark to misread the Psalms. But many common folk, not being professionally pious, used their intersleep hour for entirely less spiritual things, fertile things, playful things, like sewing or sinning. Whispered courtship and stolen kitchen kisses were quite common in the candlelit hush, as were impolite yawning competitions and quiet munching on leftover stews. There are even casual nods in 13th century texts to something delightfully called pillow talk, proving that even when life was brutish and short, it had its blushes. A few insomniac inventors found usefulness in that wakeful span. In Tudor villages, blacksmiths might step out to check their tempering coals, while shepherds used the moonlight to write absolutely riveting wool tallies. And if you ever wondered whether anyone penned poetry then, the answer is yes, and much of it before 3 a.m. An anonymous 15th century verse reads, "For twice I slept, and in between, my mind did drift through woods unseen." That, or possibly, he'd just eaten too much cheese before bed. Second sleep, when it drifted back upon weary bones, crept softer than the first. It was said to be deeper, richer, like a good encore performance from your own subconscious. Physicians of the time believed that this second slumber was when the body healed, the soul stirred, and the stomach, having finally given up requesting a midnight pie, rested. One French medical text quipped that no digestion can occur rightly in the night unless the sleep be twain. Apparently, even in the Middle Ages, someone was inventing wellness advice with suspicious confidence. By the time daylight wobbled over the horizon through warped glass or wood-shuttered gaps, the sleeper rose, slowly, stretchily, blinking off the weight of double dreams. A woman might tend to her fire, a man to his oxen. Fieldwork would later resume, and the knowledge of having had such a well-structured night folded neatly into tradition like well-laundered hose. It wasn't exotic. It was simply how everyone did it, like salting fish or ignoring the smell of your neighbor. But then, the city lights came. Industrial revolutions and gas lamps, steel clocks, and increasingly opinionated roosters. Suddenly, shift work replaced sheep counting, and caffeine began its unrelenting courtship of the human nervous system. The double sleep fell out of favor, not with a loud bang, but more of a defeated yawn. By the 19th century, people were told they must sleep in one consolidated block, which sounds more like a medieval punishment than a healthy routine. Yet the old ways linger quietly, in night owls and insomniacs, in midnight poets and those who wake, not alarmed but curious. So perhaps next time you stir at some odd hour, 2 a.m., eyes fluttering open like the lid of an ancient reliquary, there's no need to feel something's broken. You may just be echoing a rhythm older than coffee, caffeine, and curated sleep playlists. Maybe your ancestors are somewhere behind you, smiling sleepily through candlelight as you share in their quiet, ancient pause between the dreams. Now close your eyes, traveller of time and trivia. Let the echoes of matins' bells and murmured lullabies curl around your thoughts. Let the weight of woolen blankets and forgotten centuries lull you, until morning or second sleep, whichever arrives first.